Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gregg Scholl. I'm a trombone player in the Vancouver Symphony.
And I'm Ashley Hall, producer and host of the VSO podcast, and this is Da Capo. Well, I think we'll start our discussion today with William Grant Still.
William Grant Still is often referred to as the dean of African American composers, and he is forever associated with a period of time and a place known as the Harlem Renaissance.
Right.
This was an intellectual, social, artistic explosion which took place in the Harlem area of Manhattan in New York City in the 1920s.
Yes, and he did a lot of his composing in the 1920s and 1930s, right?
For sure. Following the Reconstruction of the South, many African Americans migrated to New York City, and in the 1920s there was this huge collective there in Harlem of musicians, including William Grant Still, as well as other artists and writers like Langston Hughes. I will say that William Grant Still often used poems by African American writers in his works, and this expression of African American feeling and identity during the Harlem Renaissance really laid the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that took place in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. So it's an incredibly important time and place in American history.
And of course, the piece that the orchestra is going to be playing was composed in 1957, so that's right in the middle of all of it.
That's right. That was directly during the civil rights period. It's also closely related in time, although it sounds very different from another piece on our program,
right.
The Chamber Symphony by Dimitri Shastakovic. These are both mid-20th century modern works that sound very different.
Still was a student of Elgar Varese?
Yes, that's true. Elgar Varese was a very modern composer in the 20th century, and his music featured all kinds of unusual instruments and ideas. He felt that if modern music was going to be described as just noise, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because according to Varese, what is music but organized noises?
Now, I know that William Grant Still had some pretty historic moments in his career, such as the first opera by any American produced by the New York Opera?
Yeah, that's exactly right. He wrote 8 operas, and one of them was premiered in New York City in 1939. It was called Troubled Island, and this was the first opera by an American of any color to be performed by the New York City Opera Company.
And I understand the subject was the Haiti Revolution.
That's right. He also wrote other operas or pieces of music related to similar themes. He wrote in 1981 a work called A Bayou Legend, and this was the first work by an African American composer to be performed on national TV.
Wow, that's really incredible. Back to the piece that's going to be performed today. So it's called Serenade, and I know it's a tone poem.
A tone poem is often thought of as a larger work. If a composer, and Richard Strauss comes to mind as a person who, rather than compose a piece of music in the symphonic form, they would choose some famous poem or some famous literary idea like Don Juan or something like that, as a basis for the work, and they would organize the work around that idea or that story or that theme. This is a fairly modern technique, and one that William Grant Still employed in this work, Serenade, as well as others that he wrote. The guy was really a musician's musician. He played in pit orchestras. He did everything that he could do to have a successful career as a musician.
Let's move on now to George Walker. We'll be hearing his Lyric for Strings.
George Walker is another African-American composer, went to Oberlin Conservatory of Music like William Grant Still, although a little bit later, a few years after. George Walker was still with us as late as 2018. He was the first African-American composer to win a Pulitzer Prize for music.
He also had a pretty significant teacher as well.
For sure. He studied with a Paris conservatory teacher named Nadia Boulanger, and this was a very famous teacher of composition. She tried her own hand at composition, but decided she wasn't very good at it, but in the end became one of the world's most famous instructors in composition, and her list of students is quite an honor roll. It includes people like Aaron Copland, Elliott Carter, and Darius Milhaud. So George Walker's compositions have very interesting compositions. He was really influenced by quite a number of different things, and they all sort of peek through at different parts of his music. You can hear the music of Chopin in there. You can hear the influence of Brahms and Beethoven. Yet he was also influenced by jazz of the early 20th century. He was influenced by folk music. He was influenced by church hymns. All these things found their way into his works, and you can hear them sometimes combined, but sometimes individually. For instance, the most modern thing that was going on in the early 20th century was 12-tone music, this dissonant sort of music that sounds very unusual to our ears. He composed music using that method, but at the same time would record music to be used in popular songs of the day. So a versatile person, another musician's musician who really wanted to do it all.
You can really hear it in his work, the very American roots, the bones in there.
Oh, for sure. The Lament was written in 1946. The piece was originally called Lament because it's based on a poem by an author named County Cullen. And it's a pretty sad poem. You can look it up on the internet. It's not very long, but this was set to music as a song by George Walker, and then he changed the song into the lyric for strings, which is a chamber piece, and that's what the orchestra will perform today.
Next up in the discussion is Edward Elgar, and we're doing his Serenade.
Yes, the Serenade by Edward Elgar is not one of his most popular works. Elgar became famous as a composer in the 1890s, so we're moving back a little bit in time to the end of the 19th century. Elgar is considered a British composer who was associated with nationalism. However, his music is not really nationalistic, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Von Williams. I can say that Elgar's music sounds typically English.
Pomp and Circumstance alone.
For sure. These are the most famous works of Elgar. Pomp and Circumstance is often played at graduation ceremonies. We've all heard it played or played it.
So let's get back to those interesting criticisms of his work.
I love to read what music critics have to say. It's usually incorrect, and this is no exception. I brought something that I can read for you. This was written by the music scholar Edward J. Dent in 1924. This was a time when Elgar's music was considered to be too emotional, that it was not quite free from vulgarity, that this excess of emotions was something that needed to be avoided. And the quote goes like this: boastful self-confidence, emotional vulgarity, material extravagance, a ruthless Philistinism expressed in tasteless architecture and every kind of expensive yet hideous accessory. Such features of a late phase of imperial England are faithfully reflected in Elgar's larger works and are apt to prove indigestible today.
Wow, okay. So you feel like this might be a little unfounded.
Most certainly. You know, Elgar's music has withstood the test of time, and nobody's really talking about the writings of Mr. Dent anymore.
Well, that stands for something, huh?
Serenade was written before Elgar decided to go pro, as it were. He had not yet made the decision to try to become a musician or a composer as his occupation. It is the earliest of his compositions that made it into the standard repertoire. It sort of stands side by side with a couple of other pieces that he wrote called The Wand of Youth. These were pieces that he simply wrote when he was a young person as music to accompany a family play that his relatives were putting on at home. He later reorchestrated these into chamber music suites that could be played, and I think he did that as well when he was still struggling with whether or not he would be a composer. At the time, he was employed working in a lunatic asylum.
Last of all, let's kind of circle back around to this idea of his music being nationalistic.
The nationalism tag is kind of applied broadly to lots of different composers from England from this time period. If we think about nationalism, we are tempted to think of it as a pro-nation, rah, rah, rah kind of thing. And that's not really what nationalism is with regards to music or other artistic forms.
Right.
Nationalism is trying to collect native music, in this case, in as pure a state as it could be found, and then using that as a basis for your compositions. Gustav Holst did this. He collected folk songs and then orchestrated them. And another composer on our concert today, Rafe Von Williams, is a very good example of nationalistic composing in music. Von Williams really saturated himself in local song, and it is sometimes said that he wasn't really discovering something new, but he was uncovering something that had been hidden and uncovering something in himself in the way that he treated folk songs and arranged them for orchestral musicians to play.
Right. Well, let's then move on to Rafe Von Williams. As you say, he was really invested in English folk song. He spent like a decade of his life collecting folk songs of England.
Von Williams felt that he had seen too many British composers end up as prisoners, end up as captives, kind of dragged on a rope by a chariot that was pulled by all these German theoretical music composers, and he resisted that kind of capture. He wanted to avoid being a composer who persisted, in his words, in serving up secondhand music that had been created in other nations. And he thought that such musicians should not be surprised when audiences prefer the real Brahms or the real Wagner or the real Stravinsky to something that a composer has been influenced by.
Right. He has received a bit of criticism maybe in his methods when collecting these folk songs. He was maybe more concerned with melody than any kind of words associated with songs, or even performers passing the songs along.
That's right. He was all about the melody, and he did not care whether it was sung or played on an instrument or where it came from. The most important thing for Von Williams was to get it down so that it could then be used as a launching point in some of his own works. Von
Williams had a really noteworthy teacher in Maurice Ravel.
Yes, it's a very odd pairing. You know, Von Williams was really dedicated to this mission he was on of British nationalism, but eventually he decided that he needed some further study, and he chose Maurice Ravel, of all people. He wrote in 1908, "I was a bumpy, stodgy, sort of dead-end person, and I was looking for a little French polish." Von Williams, if you look at pictures of him, is kind of like this big stout bear of a guy. He's dressed in a sort of cheerfully sloppy way. And Maurice Ravel was this tiny French, very dandified, very buttoned down person. But it was Ravel that helped guide Von Williams away from this heavy sort of counterpoint that was present in Germanic or Teutonic music. And once he sort of got that from Ravel, he said, now my musical education is complete.
And I understand that Ravel said of Von Williams that he was his only pupil who did not write his music.
That's right. That's absolutely right. He felt like most of the people that came to study with him ended up doing the things that he did, whereas Von Williams remained true to his own ideas, which was much appreciated by Ravel.
Von Williams did serve as a private in World War I.
Yes, it's interesting. In 1914, he was 42 years old, and he enlisted in the British Armed Services. He drove ambulance wagons both in France and then later in Greece. By 1917, he was part of the Royal Artillery, and they saw a fair amount of combat in the war. In fact, Von Williams damaged his hearing during the war, and later in life became deaf, and he was convinced that it was in part because of his military service in an artillery unit.
World War I wasn't his only sort of involvement in a war effort. He did write the film score for a World War II propaganda film, 49th Parallel.
That's right. That's right. And I believe in that time period, many British and other composers wrote film music as just another way for themselves to generate income and to stay busy.
And this film was starring Leslie Howard and Laurence Olivier, so it was a very English affair.
Yeah, those are some highbrow names. Von Williams didn't just write film music. He wrote 9 symphonies, and some of them are still part of the repertoire today. He wrote stage works for various kinds of productions. He wrote choral music, he wrote songs, he wrote chamber music, and he wrote music for bands, just wind instruments to play. So his catalog is actually fairly diverse. The folk music that led to today's performance is a folk song. This is called Music from Divus and Lazarus. This was a perfect example of Von Williams taking a folk song and changing the treatment of it or setting it down, orchestrating it a certain way for a chamber ensemble.
Our next composer takes us a bit further back in time compared to everyone else. We've got Antonio Vivaldi's Concerto Alarustica.
Yes, we're going all the way back to the Baroque for this one. Vivaldi lived from 1678 to 1741. He's really considered one of the heavyweight musical composers of the Baroque period.
Right.
He's famous for writing several pieces of music, but he was also a virtuoso violinist. He was a teacher, and he was a Catholic priest of all things. He was regarded as one of the greatest Baroque compositions of all time.
Yes, absolutely, and especially noteworthy for his operas.
Vivaldi claimed, and I don't know why he would lie, that he wrote 94 different operas. We have about 50 of those that exist now. They're still, at least in the 20th century, maybe in the 21st, we can hope, finding additional Vivaldi works here and there. Sometimes they locate them in the wall of a church or something like that.
Right. In 1926, I think, they found 14 folios of his work that had believed to be lost during the Napoleonic Wars.
So there could be 44 operas out there still to be discovered.
Well, we can hope so.
That's right.
Now, his work sort of faded away after the Baroque period. He was much lesser known after that.
He did fall out of popularity. The same thing happened to J.S. Bach, an even earlier composer. Vivaldi's work came back into the forefront primarily because of the famous violinist Fritz Kreisler,
right,
who wrote a violin concerto in C in the style of Vivaldi, but told everyone that it was actually written by Vivaldi.
Right, what a wild thing to do.
And this sort of propelled Vivaldi's music back into the limelight. You know, he wrote this famous piece of music, The Four Seasons, which they play a couple of times a week on the classical radio station. It's hard to imagine a world where that work would have been totally unknown.
So Concerta Alarustica is sort of interesting as concertos go. Being that it is not written with any particular solo instrument.
That's right. It's considered a concerto for the orchestra. Instead of having one soloist playing away like in the Four Seasons, everyone sort of gets a chance to shine as a group. It's also worth mentioning there's no program to this music. It's not supposed to depict Four Seasons or anything else in the world. It's more abstract in nature, just pure music that Vivaldi put together. It was commissioned by the Ottoboni family, a very powerful family that lived in Rome, and they were typical of a very wealthy family in Italy that would pay money to composers like Antonio Vivaldi to write music.
All right, well, let's move on to Shostakovich. We're doing the Chamber Symphony.
Yes, Dimitri Shostakovich is my favorite composer. I'm very partial to Russian music. Salvador Brotans, our music director and conductor for these 30 years, is also partial to Shostakovich and Russian music. So we've enjoyed the ability to play many Shostakovich pieces. I'm not sure the Chamber Symphony has been played by the Vancouver Symphony before. It was a perfect piece to play since we're not having wind instruments on this concert, and I'm certainly glad it was selected for today.
Now, Shostakovich obviously had a pretty tumultuous career given the place and time that he was composing.
For sure, the work of Dimitri Shostakovich is sort of inextricably entwined with political developments in Russia, particularly after the Russian Revolution. When the Communist Party took over that country, advanced or modern music was banned, and yet Shostakovich was an advanced composer of modern music, so he had to walk a very unusual tightrope to get his ideas out on paper and yet not get in trouble with the authorities.
Right. Any abstraction was strictly forbidden. Everything had to be pretty nationalistic at that time.
And that's one of the most fascinating things about Shostakovich. You know, Prokofiev fled to the United States by way of Japan after or during the Revolution. Stravinsky was separated from his money in Russia during the Revolution, ended up going to Switzerland and France, and then moved to Hollywood, California. Shostakovich stayed home. He stayed in Russia and continued to do the work. And if we listen to it now, for instance, his Fifth Symphony, you'll hear this music that sounds like a crazy military march sort of gone completely out of control. And yet the communist overlords and the ministers of music and things like that got behind it and they loved it. They didn't understand the level of sarcasm and irony that was present in this music, which is amazing to us, but our ears have become more sophisticated over the years, and we know more about what that music meant. At the time, he was really risking it all to compose that kind of music, because in many ways he was sort of thumbing his nose at the Russian government without them really knowing it. It was a very sort of weird time and place for a composer, and he's really the only one that pulled it off the way that he did.
Yeah, quite a scary tightrope to walk there, so fairly brave.
That's right. Members of his family were taken away to the Gulag. Poets, other people that he knew would suddenly disappear in the night, and there are many times he wrote that he was afraid that the next knock on the door was going to be the police taking him away.
He sort of fits into an interesting place in the timeline of Russian classical music.
Tchaikovsky is sometimes considered by some players to be almost vulgar, that it's too emotional, that he's just got his feelings, you know, kind of on his shoulder, or he wears his heart on his sleeve, and
a little sappy, maybe.
It's just too much. I disagree. I think the music of Tchaikovsky is incredible just because of that quality of emotion and things going up and down. But Shostakovich really extrapolated that. There are other 20th century composers like Gustav Mahler,
of course,
who took music and made it more of this psychological inward journey. But Shostakovich really has it all. There are many points in his work where it just sounds like the sound of a person becoming completely mentally unhinged. And I think that is what was occurring with him, and it found its way. He was a very taciturn individual, but it found its way out. It was expressed through his music.
Especially in his later work, the real tragedy of it.
He dealt with incredible stress, and I think it found its way out in all of those pieces. Some of his later works are very intense and sad and depressing to listen to. I don't think that he was a person that gave up hope, but he certainly didn't shy away from the beauty of something that is real, even if it is somewhat depressing.
Right, and then the Chamber Symphony does fit into this later period of his work.
Yes, you can hear that, and you can hear it. It is compared to some of his string quartets from the later period, and you can hear that maturity and that gravity of a composer who's not trying to be funny or ironic anymore.
Well, it's going to be a real treat to hear it tonight.
Can't wait.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in early to hear Da Capo with Gregg and Ashley.
Thanks for coming to our first streamed concert. We hope you enjoy the show.
See you next time.